They said she's not with us. That was the sentence that tore me out of the life I thought I still belonged to.
My son said it, not even looking at me, not lowering his voice, just handing over his documents to the border guard with the same casualness you use when you wave away a stranger who has followed too close behind in a line.
3 words, flat and simple, but so sharp they cut me loose from the family I had raised with my own hands, the family I had fed and clothed, and carried across borders when he was still a boy who needed me for everything. At that moment, I felt my bones stiffen inside my coat, as if they had been hollowed out by cold. The guard's eyes slid from his face to mine, and something shifted in his posture. He checked my passport first, not theirs. He nodded with the kind of measured respect bureaucrats learn to distribute sparingly, and then he did something unexpected. He gave me a small salute, not mocking, not exaggerated, just a quiet recognition. It startled me because it carried more dignity than I had received from my own flesh and blood in years. My son didn't notice, or maybe he did and chose to ignore it, because acknowledgement would have required him to admit what he had just done. I am 78 years old. I live alone now, in a narrow rented room above a bakery near the train station. The walls smell faintly of yeast in the mornings, and at night I can hear the rattling of the last freight cars passing by. I make my tea on a single electric coil, and sometimes I sit by the window and imagine I am waiting for someone to arrive on one of those trains. But no one comes. That doesn't frighten me anymore. In fact, it feels easier than waiting for people who will never arrive. Or worse, arrive only to pretend I am invisible. When you have been made invisible by your own son, the world outside feels less cruel in comparison. But still, I cannot forget the checkpoint, the cold air in that border station, the sound of papers sliding across the counter, the way my son's voice, once so soft when he called me Mama, transformed into that clipped, efficient tone he uses now for strangers he wishes would vanish. I was not always a woman to be set aside. Once, I was the one who carried the family forward, who bore the weight of suitcases too heavy for his small arms, who kept coins hidden in my shoe to make sure we could buy bread even if his father lost his job. I was the one who memorized phone numbers in case a payphone was the only link between us and safety. I was the one who carried his birth certificate folded in wax paper, guarding it as though it were a sacred relic, because without it, there would be no schooling, no doctor's visit, no proof of belonging in the place we dreamed of reaching. I remember one crossing long ago, when we were younger, when hope still outweighed fear, and how I whispered to him to stay close, to keep his eyes down, to let me do the speaking. He had pressed his small hand into mine so tightly that I felt the bones of his fingers, fragile but insistent, reminding me that my job was to hold him upright until he could walk alone. That was the boy I raised, and now, decades later, he was the man who told the guard, "She's not with us." The line moved slowly that day, and time seemed to stretch like chewing gum pulled too far, sticky and uncomfortable. My daughter-in-law stood beside him, lips pressed in that thin smile she saves for when she is pretending everything is fine. She never looked at me, not once, not even when the guard gestured for me to step aside to a separate lane. She placed a firm hand on my grandson's shoulder and guided him through without pause, as though the removal of one body from the group did not require acknowledgement. I watched the back of their heads, the way families often appear in airports or stations, clustered together, shepherded forward by parents who know where they are going. I used to be that shepherd. Now I was the discarded sheep.
I stood there, clutching my handbag, the one with the broken zipper I had repaired twice already, because I do not like wasting money.
Inside were my papers, my pills, a scarf folded neatly in case the air grew colder, and a single chocolate wrapped in foil I had meant to give my grandson during the trip. I did not take it out. He had not looked at me once, not even to ask if I was hungry, not even to wonder if I was keeping up with the line. My son's voice, calm and measured, floated back to me as he spoke to the guard about the family's itinerary, the hotel reservation, the purpose of their visit. Purpose. That word struck me as I stood there. Their purpose no longer included me. When the guard examined my passport, his brow softened. He noticed the dates, the stamps, the life etched into the pages. He did not rush. He asked if I was traveling alone, and before I could answer, my son said, "She's not with us." It was easier for him, I suppose, to cut the string cleanly than to acknowledge that I was both with them and not with them, both part of their blood and excluded from their circle. The truth is more complicated, and complicated truths make people uncomfortable. Better to erase, better to dismiss. But for me, standing in that sterile hall with its humming fluorescent lights and its smell of disinfectant, it was not easier. It was shattering. I wanted to speak, to correct him, to remind him of who I was, but my voice lodged in my throat. There is a kind of silence that comes not from weakness, but from the knowledge that words will not land where they should. I could have said, "I carried you across this border once when you were too young to know the difference between one country and another." I could have said, "I gave you the life that allows you to stand here now with your fine jacket and your expensive luggage and your polished wife who smiles without seeing me." I could have said, "I am the reason you are." But none of it would have changed the fact that, in his eyes, I was already a ghost. The guard stamped my passport and slid it back to me. His salute was small, almost hesitant, but it steadied me more than anything else that day. For 1 second, I was not invisible. For 1 second, I was acknowledged as a person with history, with weight, with presence. It is strange how dignity can arrive from the hands of a stranger while being stripped away by your own family. I held on to that moment like a rope, a fragile lifeline stretched across a chasm of rejection. Later, when I sat alone on the bench near the inspection hall, waiting without being told what to do, I felt the memory of those words settling into me. "She's not with us." I rolled them around in my mind, tasting their bitterness, trying to understand how a child I once protected could now protect himself from me. The answer was not in logic, but in the slow erosion of gratitude, the way love can be taken for granted until it calcifies into annoyance, until presence becomes burden. I was not a grandmother in their story that day. I was excess luggage, the kind airlines charge extra for, the kind people leave behind if the weight is too much. So that is where my story begins. Not in a cozy kitchen with photographs of grandchildren on the fridge, not in a sunny living room where family gathers around me for wisdom, but at a border checkpoint where my own son severed me with 3 words. I am 78. I live alone now, and though my room is small, and though my hands tremble sometimes when I button my coat, I hold my passport like proof of something no one can erase. That I still exist, stamped and acknowledged, carrying the memory of who I was and the painful clarity of who I am now. The moment of betrayal did not arrive with thunder or spectacle. It arrived quietly, with the polite firmness of an official voice confirming what I already suspected but did not want to believe. The guard, after stamping my documents and handing them back with that subtle salute, glanced at the screen before him, his finger moving along the list of travelers connected by one booking number. He hesitated, then looked up at me again with a kind of careful compassion that almost embarrassed me. "Ma'am," he said gently, "your family has been processed separately. Their documents are filed together, but yours is not attached to theirs." It was a simple sentence, but the weight of it was enough to press me deeper into the hard plastic chair where I sat waiting. My son had not simply misspoken in the line, had not merely made a momentary slip when he said I wasn't with them. He had formally, deliberately, structured it that way. Their reservation had been made without me included. Their journey had been logged as if I were a stranger who happened to be walking in their shadow. That was the confirmation. the quiet act of exclusion that hardened into fact the very moment it appeared on the screen. I asked the guard in a voice lower than I expected, "So I am traveling alone?" He nodded slowly, as though trying to soften the truth. "Yes, ma'am, that is how it appears." My son did not turn, did not even glance back over his shoulder to gauge whether I had heard this verdict. His wife was already guiding the children ahead, her manicured hand resting firmly on the shoulder of the eldest, steering him through the final gate toward the promise of the trip they had planned. My son followed, suitcase in one hand, his other arm casually adjusting the strap of his leather satchel, the same satchel I had once admired in a shop window, and quietly slipped him money to buy. That detail stung in the moment, because I remembered the day I gave him the envelope of cash, telling him, "Buy it for yourself, Daniel. You deserve something nice." He had smiled then, a genuine boyish smile. But the man at the border did not carry any trace of that expression. He moved forward with the confidence of someone who believed he had nothing to explain. I remained seated. Time slowed. The hall around me filled with other families shuffling through the process, children whining, parents fumbling for documents, luggage wheels rattling across the tiled floor. Life continued in its noisy, chaotic rhythm, and yet for me, everything had narrowed into one still point: the knowledge that I had not been forgotten, not overlooked, but intentionally severed. Forgetting is a mistake. Severing is a choice, and choices are planned, prepared, considered before being carried out. My son had planned this. He had spoken with his wife, they had decided on the logistics, and they had chosen not to tell me until the moment it could no longer be undone. That realization, more than the words themselves, pierced me. The guard lingered near me for a moment, perhaps expecting me to ask for help, perhaps wondering if I needed an escort back to the other side. I shook my head lightly, forcing a small smile, the kind of expression women my age learn to offer when they want to conceal humiliation behind a mask of composure. He nodded once and stepped away, leaving me in the hum of fluorescent lights and the cold echo of empty chairs. My handbag sat heavy on my lap, and I pressed my hands against it, not to steady the bag but to steady myself. I felt as though I might float away, not upward but sideways, into a void where names and relations no longer held meaning. It was then that I remembered another border, decades earlier, when I was the one orchestrating the passage. My son had been no older than 8, his hair falling into his eyes, his shoes too small, because money was tight and he had insisted he could last another season without new ones. We had traveled in an old borrowed car, my husband asleep in the passenger seat after working a night shift, and I had carried the responsibility of getting us all across. I spoke to the officer, handed over the papers, explained our purpose. My son had leaned against me, trusting, silent, secure in the knowledge that his mother's presence was enough to shield him. That day, the documents had all been tied together. One family unit, no separation, no exclusion. That day, I had been the anchor. To remember that moment now, while sitting alone at another border, disowned by the very child I had once carried forward, felt like stepping into a cruel echo chamber where the past mocked the present. When the family returned from the secondary inspection where their luggage had been checked and their plans confirmed, my son walked past me without pausing. He glanced in my direction only long enough to say, in a neutral tone, "It's better if you stay here for now. We'll sort out your arrangements later." Later. A word that carries the promise of nothing. His wife avoided my gaze entirely, her hand tightening on the strap of her handbag, as if she feared I might grab it for balance. The children followed quietly, their eyes on the floor, not daring to look at me, though I knew at least one of them must have wondered why their grandmother was not walking with them. Children notice more than adults believe, but they are trained quickly to imitate silence. I sat there, frozen, while the truth settled like dust after a demolition. The wall had been knocked down, the house of belonging collapsed, and all that remained was rubble. I realized with a clarity that almost frightened me that this was not an accident. My son was not careless. He was many things: practical, ambitious, sometimes cold, but never careless. He had made a decision, and it was final. He had decided that his family's journey would be smoother without me, that his wife's comfort and his children's image of leisure mattered more than the woman who had once stood between him and hunger. And he had executed that decision with the efficiency of a man booking tickets online. One click, one omission, one erasure. The catalyst, the spark that split my life in two, was not a shouted insult or a dramatic confrontation. It was the soft clicking of keys when he purchased those tickets without my name attached, the quiet acquiescence of his wife when she nodded and agreed, the silence in which they chose not to inform me. It was the border guard's gentle confirmation that sealed it into fact. It was my son's refusal to even acknowledge what he had done, because to acknowledge it would have required a justification, and justifications leave room for rebuttal. Better, in his mind, to make it seem natural, inevitable, a simple bureaucratic truth. Better to let me feel as though I were the one out of place, rather than admit that he had cast me out. That was the moment, sitting in the sterile hall of a border crossing, papers in hand, dignity hanging by a thread, when I understood that my life had been divided. Before I was still mother, still grandmother, still tethered however weakly to their world. After, I was simply a woman with a passport, a handbag, and no place to belong. That was the betrayal that set everything else in motion. The hours after that confirmation did not erupt into confrontation. They dissolved into something slower, quieter, and in many ways more humiliating than anger could have been. Anger has heat. It has a pulse. It can be carried like a weapon. What I experienced was colder, a gradual freezing over, as though each minute chipped away at the warmth that still connected me to them. I remained in that border hall, not because anyone told me explicitly to wait, but because the absence of instruction became its own command. My son spoke the way people speak when giving orders without responsibility. Vague, deferential, but final. "It's better if you stay here for now," he had said, and so I stayed, as though my obedience were still required, as though I had not just been stripped of the role that had defined me for most of my life. Around me, the noise of travel continued, indifferent to my unraveling. Families gathered their passports and boarding passes. Mothers checked snacks in plastic bags. Fathers muttered about exchange rates. Children darted in and out of lines like restless birds. Every person in that space seemed to belong to someone, tethered by obligation or affection, while I sat anchored only by the weight of my handbag and the memory of the words that had unmoored me. The guard who had stamped my passport walked by once, his eyes catching mine for a second, but he said nothing. Perhaps he had seen too many scenes like mine, too many discarded elders set aside like unnecessary luggage, or perhaps he knew silence was the only dignity left to offer. The escalation was not a single dramatic gesture, but a series of omissions that accumulated until they formed a wall between us. My son did not return to check on me. My daughter-in-law did not offer me so much as a bottle of water. The children did not wave or glance back. I was there, visible, yet already forgotten. And the longer I waited, the clearer it became that my presence was not an oversight, but an inconvenience they preferred to leave unsolved. After the first hour, I stopped scanning the crowd for their faces. After the second, I stopped rehearsing the excuses I might give if someone asked why I was alone. By the third, I began to understand that solitude was no longer temporary. It was being reshaped into my permanent state. I thought of the chocolate wrapped in foil inside my bag, the small gift I had planned to slip into my grandson's hand when he grew restless on the journey. It remained untouched, and as the hours passed, It transformed from a gesture of sweetness into a relic of naive hope. I could not bring myself to eat it, not yet, because doing so would mean acknowledging that it would never serve its intended purpose. That foil wrapper became a symbol, glittering faintly whenever I reached into the bag for tissues or pills, reminding me that I had prepared to care for them in small ways they had never prepared to care for me. By late afternoon, the hall had thinned, and the announcements echoing through the loudspeakers grew less frequent. I was still sitting, still waiting, though by then I no longer expected anyone to return. A woman at the information desk glanced at me occasionally, her expression cautious, as though wondering whether she should intervene. Eventually I rose and approached her, my legs stiff from inactivity. When I asked if she could check whether my family had crossed through, she typed quietly, hesitated, then told me that the group under my son's name had already cleared, already moved on, already vanished into their own journey without me.
I nodded, thanked her, and walked back to my seat with the slow steps of someone carrying a verdict inside her chest.
The escalation was in the details. The way my phone remained silent in my bag, no messages arriving to explain or apologize. The way my son's face, when last I saw it, was composed into a mask of neutrality, a man avoiding confrontation not out of kindness, but out of convenience. The way my daughter-in-law's hand tightened on her child's shoulder, steering him away from me as though I were a figure best left unacknowledged. Each detail on its own could have been forgiven, dismissed as fatigue or oversight, but together they formed a pattern too deliberate to ignore. And in that pattern, I saw the shape of my future. Diminished, excluded, managed into silence. I tried to imagine what they were doing at that very moment. Perhaps checking into a hotel with clean sheets and a view of the water. Perhaps ordering room service. My son sipping a drink while his wife unpacked their coordinated outfits, the children flopping onto the bed with their phones. I wondered whether they spoke of me, whether my absence was explained as a logistical mishap or brushed aside altogether. I wondered whether my grandson asked where I was, and if so, what answer he was given. She's resting, perhaps. Or, she'll join us later. Lies are easy to feed to children when they are busy with screens and snacks. But the truth is harder to smother when it echoes in the mind of the woman left behind. The fluorescent lights in the hall buzzed faintly, and the air grew colder as evening approached. I wrapped my scarf around my shoulders, not for warmth, but as a gesture of self-protection, as though the fabric could shield me from the shame that prickled across my skin. I realized then that shame was the tool they had handed me, the invisible leash that would keep me from making a scene. They knew I would not shout, would not demand answers, would not create a disturbance that might embarrass them. They trusted my dignity to be their alibi, and I gave it to them, because I could not bear the thought of reducing myself to a spectacle in front of strangers. The longer I sat, the more I understood that invisibility is not sudden. It is incremental. It begins with small exclusions. A conversation you are not part of. A meal you are not consulted about. A trip booked without your input. It grows in silence, in the spaces where your name is not spoken, in the glances that slide past you as though you are furniture rather than family. And then one day it crystallizes into a moment like this, at a border where your very existence is denied, and you realize that the process has been underway for years. You were being erased slowly, so slowly that you mistook it for aging, for the natural order of things, until suddenly you see it for what it is. A decision made by those you love to carry forward without you. By the time the information desk closed and the lights dimmed in the hall, I had stopped waiting altogether. I sat with my passport in my lap, staring at the ink of the recent stamp as though it might provide guidance. It was proof of passage, proof of identity, proof that I still belonged somewhere, even if not with them. That realization was small, but it mattered. I understood that night that I could not return to the place I had been. I could not step back into the role of grandmother as convenience, mother as burden. Something had shifted irreversibly, and though I did not yet know what path lay ahead, I knew the path behind me was gone. The escalation, then, was not the abandonment itself, but the quiet recognition that followed. It was the slow dimming of hope, the steady weight of silence, the realization that my waiting was not a pause but an ending. And once I saw that truth clearly, I knew I could no longer sit on that bench like an obedient child. I had to stand, to move, to carry myself across a border of my own choosing. I did not leave the border hall in a rush, nor with the energy of defiance, but with the slow, deliberate steps of someone who knows that standing still any longer would mean dissolving entirely. My body ached from the hours of waiting, my knees stiff, my back heavy, but the ache was more than physical. It was the ache of being tethered to a chair where dignity had no air left to breathe. I rose quietly, gathered my bag, pressed the passport into the inside pocket of my coat, and walked toward the exit as though I were simply another traveler, no different from the families pulling their suitcases behind them. And in that moment, I realized I was no longer waiting for someone to come back for me. The shift was not loud, not even fully conscious, but it was real. I stopped expecting to be retrieved and began moving under my own command, however small and uncertain that command might be. Outside, the air was sharp, colder than I had anticipated, and the wind carried the dry scent of asphalt mixed with faint exhaust from buses idling nearby. I stood under the awning for a moment, my scarf pulled tight around my neck, and I allowed myself to simply breathe, long, slow breaths that reminded me I was alive not because someone had claimed me, but because I still inhabited my own body. That was the first taste of freedom, bitter and trembling though it was. I walked slowly toward the station, not with any destination in mind, but with the need to be somewhere that was mine, even if only temporarily. I had no plan, no reservation, no clear map, but what I did have was my passport, a bank card, and the memory of another time when I had crossed this same kind of threshold, except then it was for him, for my son, to carry him into a life where he could be safe. Now, I crossed it for myself. As I walked, the memory sharpened. Decades ago, when he was still a boy, I had held his hand so tightly his small fingers turned red. He had been restless in the long line, asking when we would arrive, when we would eat, when he could rest. I had soothed him with stories, with promises that the place beyond the barrier would be better, that once we were through, he would see new streets, new houses, new schools. I had been his anchor, the one who knew what to say, who carried the papers, who bore the fear in silence so he would not have to feel it. That memory came back with such vividness that I almost turned, almost expected to see that small boy again, tugging at my sleeve. But of course, there was no child at my side, only the shadow of a man who had long since chosen to release my hand. The irony was sharp. The very border I had once crossed to deliver him into belonging had become the border where he cut me loose. And rather than collapse under the weight of that irony, I felt something inside me harden into clarity. If he had let go, then I too could unclasp my grip. At the station counter, my voice surprised me. It did not tremble when I asked for a ticket. It carried the firmness of a woman who had made a decision, however impulsive. I did not ask for the cheapest option, nor the most convenient. I asked for the next departure to a place I had not seen in years, a place that stirred in me an image of younger days when life was still possibility. I did not even know why that city's name came to my lips, only that it rose with certainty, as though it had been waiting beneath my silence all along. The clerk nodded, tapped on her keyboard, slid the ticket toward me. I paid with my own card, the one I had kept active with quiet discipline, the account no one else knew about. For years that card had been reserved for emergencies. I realized, standing there with the ticket in hand, that this was precisely such an emergency. though not of the kind I had once imagined. It was not illness or accident. It was the emergency of erasure, the crisis of being told you no longer belonged. The remedy was not to plead for re-inclusion, but to claim independence. On the bus, I sat by the window, the seat beside me empty, my bag resting on my lap. The lights of the border faded behind me as the vehicle rumbled onto the darkening highway, and for the first time in hours, I felt the possibility of movement in my chest. Not joy, not relief, but movement. I watched the road unfold, headlights sweeping the pavement, signs flickering past. My hands remained steady on the bag, my breathing slow and deliberate. I thought of the chocolate inside, still untouched, and instead of sorrow, I felt a strange sense of ownership. It was mine now, not a gift withheld, but a choice preserved. I could eat it whenever I pleased, or never at all. It was a small, almost laughable symbol, but symbols matter when everything else has been stripped away. Somewhere along the ride, I closed my eyes and allowed myself to imagine what awaited me. Not family, not reunion, but something quieter. A room with a bed that belonged to no one but me. A morning where I could drink tea without being told where to sit. An evening where silence was not a punishment, but a companion. These were small visions, humble, but they glowed in my mind with the light of possibility. That was the shift. I no longer thought of what they owed me, nor of what I had lost. I thought instead of what I could claim, however modest, however fragile. By the time the bus entered the city, the streets lined with dim lights and rain-slick pavement, I felt the outline of a new self beginning to form. Not whole, not healed, but moving. The betrayal at the border was still raw. The words, "She's not with us," still echoing in my ears. But alongside that echo was another sound, quieter, but insistent. My own voice saying, "I am with myself." And that was enough to begin. The days that followed my decision to step away from that border were not easy, and I would be lying if I said they were filled with sudden freedom or joy. They were marked instead by silence, by the unfamiliar rhythm of being untethered, by mornings that began without obligation and evenings that ended without anyone expecting me to appear in the living room or at the dinner table. At first, that silence pressed down on me like a heavy blanket, suffocating rather than comforting, because for so long my identity had been built on noise, the requests, the reminders, the constant pull of being needed. Without those voices, I felt as though the air itself had gone thin. But little by little, I discovered that silence has textures, and that some of them are not heavy at all. Some are light, like the quiet of a room where no one is waiting to dismiss you. That realization did not come immediately, but it came eventually, as most truths do when you are forced into solitude. I rented a modest room in the city, a space that smelled faintly of old varnish and dust, but had a window that opened onto a narrow street where I could hear the shuffle of people going about their daily errands. The bed sagged in the middle, the chair wobbled, but it was mine, paid for with my own money, chosen without anyone's approval. That act of claiming even the smallest corner of space felt like a rebellion. And yet, the past was not finished with me. For if the first escalation had been abandonment, the second arrived as the return of their voices, not in person at first, but through letters, phone calls, and the kind of pressure that disguises itself as concern. They had erased me at the border, but erasure is never clean. The outline of what is removed lingers, and the people who did the removing begin to notice the absence like a stain they cannot wash away. The first message came from my grandson, and it nearly broke me, though not in the way they intended. He had written in his unsteady teenage hand, "Grandma, where are you? Dad says you left. Mom says you were upset. I don't believe them. Please just tell me you're okay." The simplicity of his words carried more truth than all the elaborate excuses his parents must have rehearsed. I held the paper in my lap for a long time, tracing the lines of his handwriting with my finger, remembering the afternoons I used to spend with him building birdhouses or baking cookies, remembering how he was the only one who ever sat close to me. Without being asked, his letter was not a demand, not a manipulation. It was a plea for reassurance, raw and honest. For a moment, I considered packing everything, returning to the place I had fled, just to hold him and prove that I was still real. But then I remembered the border, the words spoken without hesitation, and I understood that if I returned now, it would be as though I had agreed to the role they had written for me. The old woman who accepts dismissal and then comes crawling back, grateful for scraps of inclusion. I could not do that, not even for him. So I folded the letter carefully, placed it in the drawer of my small desk, and whispered aloud to no one, "Not yet, darling. Not yet." The second message was not tender. It came in the form of a letter from my son, delivered in an envelope with my name written in his sharp, impatient script. Inside, page after page of accusations, that I had embarrassed the family, that my disappearance had caused unnecessary stress, that his wife had cried every night of the trip, that the children were confused by my absence. Not a single line acknowledged the hours I had waited, the deliberate exclusion at the border, the words that had cut me away. Instead, the letter twisted the narrative until I was the one guilty of abandonment, as though my silence had been the original wound, and not the bandage placed on the wound they had inflicted. He ended with a phrase that still burns in my memory. "We are willing to talk, but only if you are ready to be reasonable." Reasonable. The word echoed like a slap. To them, reasonable meant compliant. Reasonable meant erasing my version of events and swallowing theirs whole. Reasonable meant silence. That was the second escalation. Not just the abandonment, but the attempt to rewrite it, to gaslight me into believing that I was the one who had inflicted harm. It was no longer enough for them to leave me. They needed me to accept blame for being left. And beneath the anger in his letter, I could hear the real fear, that I might speak, that I might tell the truth, that I might claim a story that cast them not as dutiful children, but as the architects of cruelty. His panic was not about my well-being, it was about control. The third message arrived not in my mailbox, but in the form of a newspaper clipping slid under the door of my rented room. Someone, perhaps my daughter-in-law, perhaps even my son, had spoken to the press, spinning the tale of a missing grandmother who had vanished without explanation, whose family was deeply concerned for her safety. There was even a photograph of me taken years earlier, holding a pie dish at some family gathering, smiling faintly. The article quoted them both. My son saying they were desperate for answers. My daughter-in-law saying they feared something had happened to me. I laughed when I read it, a sharp sound that startled even me. Vulnerable, they had called me. Vulnerable, after leaving me on a plastic chair at a border. Vulnerable, after erasing me from their plans. The hypocrisy was almost too heavy to bear, and yet I felt lighter reading it, because it confirmed what I already knew. They needed me only as a symbol, not as a person. As long as I was silent, they could script me into their play, but silence was no longer my language. One evening, as I sat in the dim light of my room, sipping tea brewed in the chipped kettle I had bought second-hand, I heard a knock at the door. When I opened it, a man in a press suit introduced himself as a lawyer representing my son and his wife. He spoke politely, too politely, his words wrapped in legal caution. They were concerned for my safety, he said. They wished to discuss my living arrangements and ensure that my assets were being properly managed. The words assets and arrangements made my stomach clench, because I heard what was unspoken. They wanted control, not of me as a person, but of what I still carried, the remnants of money, property, savings, anything that could be leveraged. I let him speak, Then I told him, calmly, firmly, that I was safe, that I was of sound mind, that my assets were mine alone. His smile tightened, his eyes flickered, and I saw the machinery behind him, the family desperate not only to reclaim me, but to reshape me into someone pliant, someone managed. I closed the door on him with a steadiness that surprised even me. That night I wrote 2 letters, one to my son's lawyer, stating clearly and without sentiment that I was not under duress, that any further contact framed as concern would be considered harassment, that I had retained independent legal counsel and would not hesitate to defend myself. The second letter, shorter and quieter, I wrote to my daughter-in-law. In 3 lines I told her, "I know what you did. I know what you chose not to say. I am not angry. I am not coming back. Take care of your own life now. I have finally begun mine." Writing those letters felt like tightening a knot that could not be undone. They were not pleas, not apologies, not even accusations. They were closures. But closure does not erase tension. The escalation continued in subtler ways. The appearance of familiar faces near the places I frequented, the sense of being watched, the whispers of neighbors that someone had been asking about me. It was as though my absence had made me more present to them, my silence louder than any protest I could have voiced. And through it all, the one tether that remained uncorrupted was my grandson's letter, folded neatly in my drawer, waiting like a candle in a dark room. His words reminded me that not all love had soured, not all bonds had frayed. But even that tether tested me, because to respond to him would mean opening a door that his parents would rush through. I held back, waiting for the moment when my reply could be on my terms, not theirs. The second escalation was not a single event but a siege, a sustained pressure that sought to push me back into the role of the compliant matriarch, the manageable elder, the vulnerable figurehead. But with each attempt, letters, articles, lawyers, whispered rumors, I grew steadier in my refusal. They could reach for me, but they could not claim me. Not anymore. What had begun at the border as abandonment had now become a war for the narrative of my life, and I chose to write my own. The moment of climax did not arrive with shouting or confrontation at their doorstep, nor with a public scandal where I would accuse them before witnesses.
No, it arrived in the quiet space of a courthouse, a building whose walls smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper, where silence carries the weight of law. I had prepared for that day with the same determination I once used to pack a suitcase for my son when he was young, slipping in what he might need, anticipating the cold, the hunger, the long roads ahead.
But this time, I packed not food or clothing, but documents, statements, proofs of my independence, and the letter from their lawyer that had spurred me to action. I walked into that courthouse alone, my scarf tucked neatly into my coat, my shoes polished as best as I could manage, my hands trembling only slightly from the weight of what I was about to do. For months, they had circled me with pressure, the letters demanding explanations, the whispers in the neighborhood, the legal threats disguised as concern. For months, I had resisted, building walls of silence and replies measured with precision. But resistance alone was not enough. They still believed they could wait me out, that eventually I would yield, that the years of conditioning, of being the mother who sacrificed, the grandmother who complied, would reassert themselves. They underestimated the shift that had already taken place in me, the border I had crossed internally. That day in the courthouse, I made it clear not only to them, but to myself, that the era of compliance had ended. I filed the documents that severed their claim over my life. I authorized a lawyer of my own choosing, a woman younger than my son, but with eyes sharp as steel, who spoke of my rights not as if they were gifts bestowed upon me, but as facts engraved into stone. Together we drafted a declaration. I was of sound mind, in control of my assets, responsible for my own choices, unwilling to return to a household where I was treated as expendable. It was not a lawsuit for money, nor for property. It was a statement of self, a legal confirmation that the bonds they sought to twist into chains were, in fact, broken. When I signed my name at the bottom, my hand steadied, as though it had been waiting decades for this moment. But the legal papers were not the only act of reclamation. That evening, after leaving the courthouse, I went to the post office and mailed a letter to my grandson. This time, I did not hold back out of fear of his parents intercepting it, nor did I disguise my truth in polite evasions. I wrote to him plainly, telling him that I was safe, that I had not disappeared, that what he had been told about me was not the whole story. I did not pour venom into the page, because he was too young to carry the weight of his parents' cruelty. But I told him enough so that one day, when he was older, he would know I had not abandoned him. I told him I loved him, that I was building a life where I could be free, and that one day, if he wished, he could find me on his own terms, not through the filter of their lies. As I sealed the envelope, I felt a rush of something I had not felt in years, the certainty that I was shaping my own legacy. The true climax, however, came not with signatures or stamps, but with the act of turning away from them once and for all. When my son called after weeks of silence, his voice sharp with frustration, softened only by the hollow performance of concern, I answered. I listened as he spoke of misunderstandings, of family duty, of the shame my behavior had caused. He tried to weave a narrative in which he was the injured party, in which my independence was framed as cruelty, in which my silence was painted as abandonment. I let him finish. Let him spill his rehearsed words into the line.
Then I told him, calmly and without tremor, that I was no longer his burden to manage, no longer his symbol to display, no longer his mother in the sense he demanded. You released me, I said, my voice steady. At the border, with your own words, you released me. I am only honoring the truth you spoke. There was a long silence on the line, broken only by his shallow breath, and then the call ended. I did not call back. That was the climax. Not a battle won through force, but a boundary drawn so cleanly it could not be crossed again. By taking legal action, I had stripped them of the tools they sought to use against me. By writing to my grandson, I had reclaimed the narrative they tried to twist. By answering that call and refusing to bend, I had spoken the truth aloud, a truth that could not be erased. The act was irreversible, like the border I had once crossed carrying him in my arms, except this time I crossed alone, for myself, into a country where my dignity belonged solely to me. When I returned to my small room that night, I laid the signed documents on the table beside my passport. 2 items, side by side. One that proved my existence to the world, another that proved my independence to those who had tried to deny it. I looked at them for a long time, the ink still fresh, the weight of paper so much heavier than its physical form. It was not triumph I felt, nor vengeance, but something quieter, more enduring. It was finality. The ties that once bound me to their approval had been severed. I was no longer pleading to be seen. I had seen myself. In the weeks that followed, the noise around me softened, not because the world had become kinder, or because my son had suddenly transformed into someone capable of remorse, but because I had stepped beyond the reach of their voices. It was as if, by drawing a line that could not be crossed, I had entered a new country where their words no longer carried jurisdiction. My room, small and imperfect as it was, became a sanctuary. Each morning I woke to the faint scent of bread from the bakery below. Each evening I closed my curtains against the yellow glow of the street lamps, and in between those hours I began to learn what it meant to live without waiting. Waiting had been my occupation for so many years. Waiting for my son to call, waiting for an invitation, waiting for acknowledgement, waiting for gratitude. Without that constant suspension, time began to belong to me again, and I filled it with small rituals that were mine alone.
I discovered a second-hand bookshop 2 streets away and spent afternoons wandering among shelves that smelled of dust and ink, running my fingers across the spines of novels I had once meant to read, but never had the chance. I bought 1 or 2, carrying them home in a paper bag, and found that the words of strangers could keep me company in ways my family no longer could. I walked through the park at dusk, listening to the chatter of birds settling into trees, and sometimes I stopped to watch children playing, not with envy, but with a kind of detached tenderness, as though I were observing life rather than yearning for it. There was freedom in that too, to witness without the ache of expectation. The passport remained on my desk, its stamp still fresh, its pages heavy with the record of where I had been. Beside it lay the legal documents that bore my name, proof that I belonged to myself. Together they became symbols not of travel or bureaucracy, but of survival. Whenever doubt tried to creep in, whenever I heard the whisper in my mind that perhaps I'd been too severe, too unyielding, too proud, I looked at those papers and remembered the border, the bench, the silence, the words spoken so easily by the child I had once carried. "She's not with us." Those words could not be taken back, but I had chosen to transform them. They no longer meant exile. They meant release. Sometimes I thought of my grandson, of the letter I had sent him, and I wondered what he felt when he read it. Perhaps confusion, perhaps comfort, perhaps a seed of doubt about the story his parents told. I did not expect him to come to me now, not while he was still so young and so bound to their household. But I allowed myself to imagine a future where he might seek me out, not out of obligation, but out of choice. If that day came, I would greet him with open arms, not as someone reclaiming what was stolen, but as someone offering a safe harbor. Until then, I would wait, not in despair but in patience, because patience is different when it is chosen rather than imposed. I no longer rehearsed speeches in my head, no longer plotted how to make them understand, no longer wasted my nights wishing for apologies that would never come. Instead, I began to write, not letters this time, but fragments of memory, pages that told the story in my own words. I wrote about the border, about the plastic chair, about the chocolate wrapped in foil that still sat in my drawer. I wrote about carrying my son across another crossing years ago, about the feel of his small hand in mine, about the irony of being released by the same voice that had once called me Mama with such need. These pages were not for them, nor even for my grandson, but for myself, a record that my life had weight, that my voice existed, that I would not be erased quietly. As the seasons shifted, I noticed changes in myself. The fear that had once clenched my chest began to loosen. The bitterness that had burned at night began to cool, and in its place grew a steadier strength, one not born of anger, but of acceptance. Not resignation, but acceptance. The ability to see the truth without shrinking from it. I understood finally that the betrayal had cut deep, but it had also cut me free, and in that freedom was a strange, unexpected peace. I did not forgive them, for forgiveness is a gift they had not earned, but I did not carry their weight anymore either. I placed it down gently and walked forward without it. So now, when I sit by my window at night and watch the trains rumble past, I do not imagine someone arriving for me. I imagine instead the movement itself, the endless crossings, the proof that borders are both barriers and beginnings. Mine was a border that ended one life and began another. And if there is another woman sitting somewhere tonight, holding her own silence like a burden, wondering whether she still exists because her family has declared her unnecessary, I would tell her this: if they say you are not with them, then be with yourself. That is not loneliness. That is strength. That is the beginning of freedom.